morning or good afternoon to everyone who is logging in and to join our session today for the Deeper Insights webinar series. We're just going to let a couple minutes for everyone to log in, and we will get going right at 10 a.m. So Cujo and I, before starting the webinar, we were just talking about weather, and I'm in Calgary and it's minus 14 right now. And Cujo, you're tuning in from
St. Louis, Missouri, where it's a heck of a lot warmer.
So hoping no matter where you're tuning in from, maybe pop in the chat. What's the weather like for where you're at? And wishing everyone a happy new year and hope everyone had a wonderful holiday. This is our first webinar of the 2024 series. So we're excited. And no matter where you're tuning in, if you're tuning in from LinkedIn Live or from Zoom, please, this is an interactive webinar, so please feel free to hop in communicate. Vernon, BC, only -4. We have Vancouver, Kelowna, -3. Nice. Wide range. Okay, it's 10 a.m. So let's get started. Top of the hour. I want to welcome everyone to Tech Canada's latest Deeper Insights webinar series. My name is Brittany Fitzgerald, Delta Coordinator at Tech Canada. It is my pleasure to be your host for today's session. Today we're joined by Robert Cujo, who's well known among the Tech Canada and Vistage community as Cujo. Cujo is a successful entrepreneur, a multiple award-winning speaker and writer, and a sought-after consultant. Here are 3 things you should know about Cujo before he leads us through today's webinar. Number 1, he's an entrepreneur, first and foremost, who deeply appreciates the role small businesses play in their economy. Number 2, he is the current Vistage Speaker of the Year and number 1 out of 900 speakers. Bravo. And his expanding team of fighter pilot instructors share insights through Vistage, Tech Canada, in government, and in industry to help organizations win by building teams that harness high-performance team principles. Number 3, Cujo is a classically trained violin and piano player who also loves the bass guitar. He's authored and co-authored 3 national best-selling books, and he's working hard now so that he can teach his children to fly what will eventually be the family P-51 Mustang. Cujo has spoken to more than 450 groups of leaders over the past 5 years and is excited to be here with us today. Once again, please remember that whether you're joining us on Zoom or in Tech Canada's LinkedIn live stream, that this webinar is intended to be interactive. So make sure to utilize the chat function wherever you're joining us to share perspectives and questions for Cujo and receive personalized insights. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Cujo.
Well, thank you very much, Brittany, and thank you to everybody that's tuning in, kicking off the new year in this fashion, learning to debrief to win, focused on building leaders who can lead in the now. Always a joy to be able to support Tech Canada, and goodness, what a gift it is to be in your midst virtually today, talking about something that I'm personally passionate about. I'll just throw an early shout out to Brittany for being my teammate in today's webinar. She'll be the one that's taking a look in the chat room so that I don't have to figure out what it is that might have been sparked in your minds that you'd like to dig into further. And just from an overall flow standpoint, I've got some amount of content that I wanted to begin today with. I'll have slides that I'll be going through here, but I'd like to end that with enough time for us to dig into and go deeper on any of the topics that I'm about to introduce to you, all centered around how it is that we prepare to lead in the now, a time when leadership is so highly in demand and maybe where we're potentially underperforming just a tad. So let's get into it without further ado. Thank you in advance, Brittany, for your support. And let's talk about this nasty word, a word that usually conjures up a lot of angst, a word that we as leaders are probably more inclined to want to practice. But as we get further through the organization, and especially in larger organizations, a word that probably strikes fear in a lot of our teammates. And one of the things that my teammates and I typically begin a workshop session with is asking how many of us in the workshop today are satisfied by the degree of accountability practiced by my teammates. And I can tell you, I can testify to the fact that the number of hands that goes up is stunningly low. And that's across the board. That's across North America. That's inside of tech Vistage. That's outside of tech Vistage. That's the same response essentially in government, military, and anywhere that we go. And it's an interesting, fascinating experience to have because so many of us have accountability as a core value. It's listed as one of our core values, and yet we're not satisfied by the degree of accountability that's manifested by our teammates. And when I ask why that's the case, the answers are uniformly the same. It's just hard in human teams to practice this thing. A lot of times accountability means somebody pointing the finger in the face of somebody else saying, you didn't do what you were responsible for, which is an awkward experience on the receiving end. It's an awkward experience on the delivery end. And what it causes many of us to do is to just avoid it entirely. And if you just pause for a second and ask yourself, where am I on the accountability scale? Am I the person around here who has to point the finger? How satisfying is that to me? How often have I avoided doing that because of the potential implications? And then we might ask ourselves, is there a better way? Quick preview, I'm here to advocate for a better way. And the reason for this is that I've spent so much of my life dedicated to understanding how to practice accountability the right way. My background, as Brittany mentioned, is in fighter aviation. I used to fly F-15s, F-22s for the United States Air Force. And at one point in my Air Force journey, I was responsible for teaching how it is that we practice accountability in the team setting. So I've been at this, and in fact, I've written multiple papers starting back in 2004. I've been at this for a long time now, and a lot of what it is that I used to teach is still the foundation for how it is that accountability is practiced in fighter squadrons. And I think it's important for us to understand that there is a better way at a time when it's so desperately needed. So now maybe we turn to a little bit of Gallup data. And I think Gallup has the thumb on the pulse of what's going on in the business world for sure. They've got tons of data that they've been capturing for decades. We'll take a look at one of their most recent summaries. It was the State of the Global Workplace address that came out in, I want to say, September of 2023, so still relatively current. And what they said essentially was that employee engagement was improving. And they said so because the previous report, 6 months prior to this one, said that 21% of employees were thriving at work. And this most recent one, the number of employees thriving went up by 2%. So they said, hey, this is a good thing, right? This is a win. What was interesting for me as I was unpacking this thing, reading it through just prior to a tech engagement, as a matter of fact, was what it is that the rest of the global workforce is doing. So if we're not in that 23%, what are we doing at work? What Gallup reported was 59% of the global workforce is quiet quitting, which is a term that's now fully understood across the planet. It's part of our vocabulary. When people say, oh, so-and-so is quiet quitting, we get it, right? Filling a seat, watching the clock, doing the absolute minimum, and, waiting to figure out what the next step is going to be, potentially using the company's internet to figure out where they're going to go next. But if you add these two numbers together, you realize it's not 100%. So what's the rest of the global workforce doing? Gallup reports that 18%, fully 18% are loud quitting. And Gallup's definition for a term that when I was first exposed to it, I was unfamiliar with, was that this means they're taking actions to harm the organizations that employ them, which is a stunning statistic. And it's a sad revelation, the fact that people be moved to take actions to harm the organization that employs them. It's a sad state of affairs. It also tracks very closely with the work of Dr. Timothy Clark, author of The 4 Stages of Psychological Safety, someone who's very interested in understanding how do we build and maintain high degrees of psychological safety in our organization, removing fear. Anyway, the point is that this is a difficult status quo for us to lead through. And the question that's on my heart constantly is why? Why are so few of our coworkers, of the people that are out there working hard, thriving in the work that they do? When I ask that question, when my teammates and I ask this question, why is this the status quo? ultimately we get to, in usually very short order, the fact that it's a leadership issue. Actually, we could say it's an absence of proper leadership that's causing people to be disengaged in the work that they do. Now, I must confess, there's a bunch of leaders who point their fingers at certain demographics and they say these people are incapable of rising to the occasion, which is a sad state of leadership. But most of the time, the leader is willing to say, look, I don't know that I'm leading as well as I need to. I don't know that we're building the capacity to lead as effectively as we need to. And maybe we could also take a pause right now and ask ourselves, how have we equipped ourselves with the ability to lead effectively in the now? If you think about it this way, if we were successful as leaders up until the pandemic, and then we failed to change the way that we lead, and we justified that failure to change by saying, well, it's always worked for me in the past, well, then we're X many years behind. We have to realize that leadership is situational. Leadership requires change on the part of the leader to adapt to the needs of the now. And that's a difficult thing. Change is hard. We have to start by changing ourselves first before we can then equip our teammates to be able to change how it is that they lead. And so it's a complicated enterprise, rising to meet the needs of the now as leaders. And a lot of times, if we haven't been intentional about taking the proper steps, we find ourselves applying Band-Aid solutions. And across the tech and Vistage enterprises, the Band-Aid solutions are pretty standard. Number one, when it comes to accountability, the practice of accountability, most of the time it's practiced privately. And it's done so because we were all probably taught at some point along the leadership journey that we ought to, as good, compassionate leaders, praise in public and punish in private. And because accountability is oftentimes seen and practiced as a punishment, it's done privately. And I'm passionately against that. And two quick reasons. Number one, performance at the team level is a team issue. And so if at any point along the way we're underperforming, we have to recognize we as a team need to figure out why we're not performing the way that we need to. And ultimately, real learning has to happen together. We need to have the inputs from all of our teammates in order to have the truth that allows us to figure out a substantive root cause that gives us a correct way forward. Private accountability doesn't meet that need. And so that's a challenge for us as leaders to overcome. Another challenge is that these questions, hey team, what went well, and hey team, what didn't, tend to be all over the place. Like I see this constantly when I ask people, how many of us ask these questions? Lots of people raise their hand. The problem is those are insufficient questions for meaningful accountability. In fact, if there's one thing that I might take away from today's webinar, is that Cujo says, don't ever ask those questions again. And for many of us, we go, well, why wouldn't we? They seem to serve us. Two quick answers to those questions. Number one, they're the wrong questions. And number two, they're grossly incomplete as a methodology. And maybe that's something that we can dig into further as we go through today's webinar. But I'll tell you, I'm really passionately against us getting together after a project, after an event, after a webinar like this and asking, hey team, what went well and what didn't? And then finally, and I'm seeing a lot of this out there on the speaking circuit, asking leaders, what's the state of accountability? So many leaders are confessing to the fact that they're just avoiding accountability out of fear of losing somebody. Hey, Cujo, if I hold somebody to account, they're probably going to walk. Even poor performance is better than no performance. And so I'm just not holding people to account. We have to realize together as leaders, leading in a difficult time, that the avoidance of accountability is nothing but weak leadership. So we got to rise to the occasion and learn how to lead effectively in the now at a time when it's exceptionally difficult to lead. One of the lingering manifestations of this nasty virus, COVID-19, is that it's managed, and I'd say probably everywhere where this webinar is being witnessed, it's managed to expose, deepen, and widen the existing fractures in our societies to such a degree that oftentimes we find ourselves on two sides of a pretty epic divide. And it's gotten to the point where, depending on where we are, we're firmly entrenched in the idea that the other side is wrong. And if you're not with me, you're against me. And so there's an undercurrent of that tends to permeate through our organizations. And because of the fear of saying something that might get us further entrenched in that, because of that fear, we tend to throttle back on leading as effectively as we need to. Add to it the fact that these fractures and the associated politics of division, coupled with all kinds of other nasty challenges, are leading to, as Gallup's CEO John Clifton said in his book Blind Spot, the global rise of unhappiness. So one of the things that we as leaders need to be conscientious of is that there is a behind the facade of when you ask somebody, how are things going? They say, oh, things are great. At the soul level, there's a rise of unhappiness that's wearing at people's souls right now. And our teammates are looking to us as leaders for hope and optimism in a better tomorrow. The question we have to ask ourselves is, how are we as leaders providing that? What are we relying on to be able to feed our teammates that hope and optimism that despite whatever it is that's hit us today, tomorrow is somehow going to be better? Actually, today what we're talking about is geared to give us that. And then another leadership challenge that I think we need to be open to discussing regularly, call it the rise of the victim mentality. And it's a problem that has to be stopped, because victimhood does not lead to effective teamwork. And when team members are saying, look, I couldn't do my job because so-and-so didn't do theirs, and when that's the standard response, that means that we really don't have teams. So we've got to eradicate this. Maybe it's a good time for us to pause and ask ourselves, just to kind of reflect for a second, what's it costing us as leaders to allow a victim mentality to fester wherever it is that we're privileged to work? And just, having asked the question, what's happening with this amongst leaders over the last year especially, oh goodness, you can tell this is a major pain point. And I understand that pain, and I want to help eradicate it. So there's a lot that we're up against right now at a time when there is tremendous opportunity available to us. And for many of us, we're privileged to work in a company that has an incredible product or an outstanding service that we provide. We're fired up about it. We're jazzed about it. But one of the things that we've got to realize is that product, that service is not going to create a winning team. Winning teams are the result of outstanding leadership. And so there's a consistent theme over here. We've got to learn to lead effectively in order to avoid the cost of losing somebody as a consequence of poor leadership. And when we look at why it is that people leave organizations, two things are pointed out regularly. Number one, the culture. The culture here isn't one that allows me to thrive, they say, our team members who have left us. Number two, my leadership hasn't inspired me to be my very best, and I'm hopeful that there's better leadership elsewhere. Good. So how do we address this? It's probably best addressed by recognizing that accountability is the core of teamwork done correctly. And accountability has to be practiced evenly in order for the team to function the way that it's designed to. And if we think about this, it just makes sense. Like if there's an uneven distribution of accountability, then the team truly can't function as a team. And in fact, we can anticipate that the team's going to fall apart pretty quickly. Take, for example, me. I'm the leader. Everybody that's tuning in right now or that watches this on the record, we're all part of a team. And you all watch. I've assigned responsibilities to everybody here. Each one of us has a responsibility to speak during today's webinar. Okay, so as we're getting ready for today's webinar, y'all kind of over here, Brittany comes up to me and she says, hey, listen, Cujo, I've got some things going on. I'm not exactly on my A game today. I'd like to take a pass. Is there any chance that I wouldn't have to speak today? And I go, oh, Brittany, absolutely. You're good to go. No sweat. Hope things get better in the future. So you overhear that. Meanwhile, somebody else, we'll call him Steven, comes up and says, hey, listen, Cuj, same kind of a thing. I may not be on my A game today. If there's a way that you could give me a pass as well, that would be awesome. And I come back and say, what are you talking about, Steven? You've known for weeks that you're going to be speaking on today's webinar. I expect you to speak on today's webinar. Oh, by the way, Steven, if you don't speak on today's webinar talking about what it is that I told you I needed you to talk about, don't even bother coming back to work again tomorrow. On the heels of those exchanges, me having one standard for Brittany, another standard for Stephen, what do you think about me as a leader? What happens to your trust in me as the person running this enterprise? I'd say 99.9% of people surveyed say that your trust is gone. Like immediately you're losing trust in me as a leader because you recognize I've got two different standards, right? And that's just not fair. That's not right. That's not a just culture. As an interesting ripple effect, side order effect of your loss of trust in me, invariably you lose trust in Brittany. Why? Well, she didn't do anything wrong. She actually was quite honorable in saying, hey, I'm not ready for today. And she asked me for some dispensation. But when I gave her the dispensation and I didn't give it to Stephen, you're looping her in and saying, well, listen, she must be part of Cujo's A-team or whatever we want to call it. And therefore, if she's getting a pass, we can't trust her either because we can't trust Cujo. And anybody that Cujo is doing close business with is part of his inner team, and that's just not good. So we lose trust in our teammates as a consequence of the uneven distribution of accountability. And if we don't have trust, in very short order, we lose buy-in, we lose commitment, and we lose performance. And in very, very short order on the heels of that, when there is no buy-in, commitment, and performance, we're probably also going to lose some of our teammates because they realize this is not the place where they're going to thrive. And the uneven distribution of accountability is truly a deficiency in leadership. And we've got to recognize that these kinds of things happen unintentionally all the time. Like, I don't know when I'm being uneven in my distribution of accountability. It just happens, right? You know, I listen to somebody and they give me a request. I'm like, yeah, I'll give you this pass. But then somebody else comes in and based upon everything else that's on my mind, I don't give them the same standard there. And what I don't realize as a leader is that my teammates are losing trust in me. So this is something that we've got to be very conscientious of. We've got to work hard to maintain this balance because accountability is the core of teamwork done well. And what leadership necessitates is that we practice accountability the correct way. And what accountability demands of us is that we lead effectively. So it's all intertwined. How we practice accountability is really a determinant of how effective we are as leaders. And then we come to this question: what is accountability? And we throw this term around all the time. And I ask people, what's accountability? All the time. Doesn't matter whether I'm delivering a keynote. I ask that from the huge stage. I ask it in the breakout sessions. I ask it in all the workshops that I conduct. What's accountability? And folks struggle to define it. In fact, it's been my experience that leaders will come back and say, Cujo, I don't even have a good definition for this. When people do offer me a definition of what accountability is, it's usually tied to the performance or fulfillment of individual responsibilities. Okay, and that makes sense. I mean, if accountability is the means that we use to hold people to account for performance, specifically when it's not delivered, then it would make sense that it's tied to the fulfillment of individual responsibility, which I would tell you is a vastly insufficient definition. Vastly. If accountability is tied to leadership, and if those two terms, accountability and leadership, are intertwined, then we have to have something bigger than fulfillment of individual responsibility. And so this is a big takeaway from today's webinar. How do we define it in my company, VMax Group? We say that accountability is taking absolute ownership of the outcomes that we as a team achieve. And as interesting as the words in amber are, they're actually the least interesting words in this definition. So taking absolute ownership. What does absolute mean? Not qualified or diminished in any way. It would be disingenuous of me to have a caveat for me to say something like, hey, listen, I own this, but really that gets to the core of what's the most important feature of this definition. And in order to understand the most important feature, we've got to understand where this definition originates from. And this definition of accountability originates in the high-performance team world of where things are vastly different than they are in regular teams. All right, so one of the key differentiators between a regular team and a high-performance team is that there's an ethos in the high-performance world, an ethos that says if one of us fails, we all do. And that informs this definition. So if one of us on the team has failed, We've all failed. And if we understand that central ethos, then we understand that outcomes we achieve is the piece that we really need to be focused on. And if outcomes we achieve is the piece of the definition that we need to really be focused on, then we as leaders need to realize that when one of our team members has failed to meet the mark, we're probably complicit. And that's a difficult thing to wrap our minds around. A lot of times we can sit there and say, wait a second, Cujo, no, it's my job to kind of give the big picture guidance and my teammates to do the things, but big picture guidance may not be enough to equip our teammates with what it is that they need to achieve the outcomes that we achieve. And so what I want everybody here to really think about deeply after this webinar is done is, how inclined am I to be to assess my complicity in an outcome that isn't good around here? It's easy when we win, right? It's always easy to sit there and say, yeah, once again, my leadership came through and we did it. But that's not the point. The point is when things don't go well, how inclined are we to ask ourselves, how did I let my teammates down and what am I going to do to address it? And as soon as we can come to grips with that, we can start leading in a way that really drives engagement, that truly gets to performance, that helps inspire our teammates to commit and give more than they've ever given before. It's a really beautiful place to be. It just takes some extra effort on our collective parts. It also requires us to rethink and update how it is that we lead our teams. And one of the things that I've noted ever since I started teaching high-performance accountability in the business world is that accountability is an infrequently practiced event. Usually, an accountability session is something that we call an after-action review, a lessons learned, a retrospective, or a post-mortem. And when do we practice post-mortems? It's typically after something hasn't gone well. So just think about that for a second. If accountability only follows some version of a failure, what's the enthusiasm for it amongst our teammates? It's usually pretty low, right? And if accountability only follows a failure, then when we get together to have a post-mortem, the overall sense of excitement is probably low. The enthusiasm for it is probably even lower. Folks are just biding their time until this thing is done, and they want to run from it and hope that it doesn't happen again. And that doesn't serve us. So I would say we need to update how it is that we lead our teams in two ways. Number one, we ought to ritualize accountability. It ought to be an all-the-time thing, not an occasional thing. And number two, I think it's really important that we change our understanding of what accountability is and how it can truly serve us. And to me, as a former fighter pilot, accountability was never a weapon. It wasn't levied as a means of punishing my teammates. It wasn't something that I would personally rely on to try to whip people back into gear. It's an option for sure. And on that spectrum of options that we as leaders have available to us, I suppose that's one of them. But in the high-performance team world across the globe, the way that accountability is typically practiced is as a means of helping the team to learn. And when we rethink accountability as a means of inspiring our teammates to learn, it requires us as leaders then to evolve into coaches, mentors. And when we're coaching and when we're mentoring our teammates, we're creating an environment that causes them to want to engage, perform, commit, give their all. And that's a great place for us to be. So I say again, I think we need to update how it is that we lead our teams by doing two things. One, making accountability an all-the-time feature of how it is that we do the work that we do, while simultaneously changing our collective understanding of accountability, moving away from its weaponized format into a world where we harness accountability to help our teammates to learn. And in this new world, we realize that accountability can truly serve us. And it can serve us by driving engagement, pulling people in. That's how it works in a fighter squadron for sure. And the reason that it's such a engaging tool is that it's our competitive advantage. We realize that accountability serves us, and because it serves us, it's something that we want to get to. And the reason that it's our competitive advantage and it serves us is that this is the place that we go constantly to learn on the heels of a win so that we can replicate that win again in the future, and on the heels of a failure so that we can figure out how to never fail this way again. And I'll pause here for just a second. Allow everybody a moment to take a look at this slide, maybe take a screenshot of it or do whatever it is that you need to do to capture these words. And if you do take that screenshot, I would encourage you to take and maybe print out that screenshot, put it up someplace on a wall close to where it is that you do the preponderance of your work, and then reflect on it daily and ask yourself, are you living up to that standard? And if not, why not? And what are you going to do about it? This, friends, is a great place for us all to be. And the way that we can learn best is through a ritual called the debrief. And the debrief is something that I inherited when I joined the United States Air Force. I didn't create this concept. It's been around in the fighter business since World War I. It's something that I was assigned the responsibility for teaching to the United States Air Force. When I was given that responsibility, I must confess that I was very disappointed, because truly, of all the things that I could be responsible for teaching at the U.S. Air Force Weapons Instructor course, I thought it was probably the least sexy topic that one could get, and yet there it was. I had to take this thing on, and as you all know, because I had to learn how to teach it, I became really good at practicing it. Anytime that you're forced to teach something, it really forces you to have to learn it well. And the more that I practiced it and the more that I learned about it, the more that I recognized what a brilliant idea it was, and the more passionate I was to take this idea into the world writ large, specifically into the business space. Which begs the question then, what is a debrief? It's three things. The way that we define it at VMax Group, very simply, it's the constructive evaluation of the quality of our decisions and associated actions measured against the objectives we set out to achieve. And I'll offer that definition one more time. It's an important one. What's a debrief? It is the constructive evaluation of the quality of our decisions and associated actions measured against the objectives we set out to achieve. And the good news for everybody here who's saying, Cujo, you're speaking far too fast, I didn't get all that stuff down, is it's going to be in the PDF that you're getting as a gift for attending today's webinar. Chapter 6 of my book, Debrief to Win. That definition is page 3. So you've got it. You've got it in written format. And chapter 6 of my first book, Debrief to Win, is the methodology chapter where I outlined how it is that we practice positive, forward-focused accountability in high-performance teams so that you can do the exact same. And that's something that we can dig further into. And what I would tell you is that the debrief practice, the way that high-performance teams do it, is embedded into a team life cycle that helps a team to be able to learn constantly. Not just occasionally, not just on the heels of a failure, but constantly. And the debrief done correctly helps us to learn how to plan more effectively. And one of the biggest revelations that I've had teaching this to business leaders is that we don't plan very effectively in businesses, period. Dot. Now that's a pretty wide open, broad statement, and it's very, very true. Where I go, what I find is even in teams that think they're planning well, they're not. We don't know how to tactically plan well. Strategically speaking, we're doing all right. Tactically, we're missing the mark. We need to learn how to plan effectively, how to plan correctly in order to set ourselves up to practice meaningful and effective accountability. And for so many of us, not only is our definition of what accountability is insufficient, but we haven't even set ourselves up to be able to practice accountability at all because we haven't planned, period. And so these two pieces, tactical planning and team accountability, team learning by way of the debrief, they're very closely intertwined. And as soon as we can understand how to plan well, we can set ourselves up to learn how to learn well. And that puts us into a position to be able to navigate disruption, which everybody, especially here at the outset of a new year, needs to be predisposed to doing. We have to learn how to navigate disruption by learning constantly. The good news for us, and oftentimes we give into the self-limiting belief that we don't have enough time to be able to do this stuff. The good news for those of us who are willing to commit to learn to use our time more effectively is, and this is according to two researchers with no connection to any armed forces across the globe that I can discern. Their names are Tannenbaum and Sarasoli. About a decade ago, they came across the debrief model. They were intellectually curious. They said, this sounds really fascinating, and so they ran a meta-analysis to study its effectiveness. And then they reported on the outcomes of their debriefs over and over again in multiple scholarly journals. And what they determined was that individuals and teams that know how to do what we're talking about today, they see a huge performance boost, 20 to 25%. What I've noticed is that these numbers can be really, really low, 20 to 25%. I've had all kinds of folks come back to me on the heels of employing what it is that we've taught, telling us that they've blown these numbers out of the water. For our purposes today, 20 to 25% is the mark. And maybe this would be a good time to individually document what it is at the outset of a new year, a 20 to 25% performance boost would do for you. And so you can maybe pause the webinar. If you're watching this on the replay, you can truly do that right now. Maybe take a note. Maybe note, I probably ought to think about what the ramifications of this would be. And I'll tell you what it is that I want for you. And the true answer is, I don't care at all about your revenue. I mean, okay, probably should caveat that. I do care about your revenues. I need you to stay strong. I need you to keep on growing. But more importantly than the revenue implication of a 20 to 25% performance boost, from my vantage point, is to give you as a leader the capacity to reduce stress so that you can think. And to me, equipping ourselves with the bandwidth to be able to think, to be able to make high-quality decisions, to help guide and steer your team as effectively as you need to. That's the number one benefit of getting this kind of a performance boost. Lower stress, the ability to think, to be able to lead and guide your teammates more effectively. That's what I'm hoping for everybody that's tuning into this live, and for all of you who are tuning in to watch this sometime in the future. And I see Brittany coming up on screen. There may be a question. This is where her assistance, mutual support is so much appreciated. Brittany, what questions are popping up?
Yeah, we have a couple. So one of them from Joanne Zigerson asked, in a debrief after a successful project, what should be focused on?
And say that last piece again, Brittany.
In a debrief after a successful project, what should be focused on?
Good. After a successful project, we ought to figure out why it is that we won this thing, why it is that we were successful, and maybe even how it is that we were successful. And I'll stop the share here so that you can see me a little bit more clearly. Winning's not everything. How it is that we win really matters. And so if we achieved mission success, but we did so in a way that was disruptive to our teammates, that harmed our teammates, where somebody sort of dominated through, didn't allow people the opportunity to be able to speak, to be heard, to engage, then though we achieved the mission outcome, it may have actually been a failure. So how it is that we win really matters. But who it is that allowed us to be able to achieve mission success, that's an even bigger point potentially, and it's something that needs to be celebrated. And I think taking the time to identify someone's performance as the root cause of our victory equips us as leaders with the ability to then say, you did epic work today. We realize that you're the reason that we achieved mission success. Thank you for the epic work that you're doing. And that kind of warms the soul. Earlier, at the beginning of this webinar, we talked about things that tear the soul apart. But if we can come in as leaders and be more conscientious about coming to a substantive justification for why it is that we can call some of our teammates heroes, I think that really feeds the fuel of why it is that those heroes would want to come back and continue to be heroic for us. And that's important. And I've had conversations along these lines with a lot of leaders, some of whom have not been too supportive of the idea. In fact, I've had leaders push back and say, Cujo, I pay people good wages and I give them great benefits. And my expectation is that they're performing. And I would tell you, as a former military guy, that seems like an inhuman way to run a team. One of the things that I benefited from as a military guy was a really human approach to performance, one where even when we fail, my instructors, when I was learning how to fly F-15s, they didn't just sit there and say, you ruined my day. There's no hope for you. Go find another source of employment. Quite the opposite. They would tell me, all right, Cuj, you did this well today, and that was an evolution over your last iteration. By the way, you did this part superbly. Like you really knocked it out of the park. Now, let's take a look at this one thing. This one thing, Cujo. Can you imagine if you had done this one thing differently, how much better of an experience we would have had today? Any chance that you might be able to do that one thing differently tomorrow? I'm like, yeah, I think I can. Okay, I fully believe that you can, Cujo. And the message to me was, you're capable of achieving what it is that we need from you. And by the way, you're doing a lot of things great. Those messages, they were really supportive to me, and they helped me to be able to learn to do something really complex in a really dangerous environment. You know, with my background as a violin and piano player, one would argue that maybe I wasn't the best equipped to do these things that I was asking of myself. My instructors, almost to a person, did a brilliant job of helping me to evolve into who it was that I became, because they focused on the good that I did. So a more involved answer there, I will say, debriefing successes can be harder than debriefing failures or losses, because we have an inclination towards criticism. Once we overcome that inclination towards criticism and we start getting comfortable debriefing the wins, it's a magnificent place for us to be.
No, thank you. Language is powerful. And you kind of went and answered the second question, which was, how do you communicate expectations to hold team members accountable without fostering a culture of blame? And I mean, I think you kind of just answered that as well, but if you have anything to add.
I, as a matter of fact, I've got about 17 hours worth of content to add. Maybe I can outline for you all a very, very quick summary of how it is that I personally think about this. Okay, how it is that we set up and equip teams to be able to win by way of accountability, especially knowing that accountability is so heavily weaponized in our world. The way that I've thought about this and then documented those thoughts and now teach it in the Tech and Vistage system and elsewhere is by way of our Leadership Accelerator framework. How do we rapidly accelerate some of these leadership skills? And it starts with, if you think of this as a flight plan towards real leadership, it starts with adopting a mission orientation to our work. And this mission orientation of work is something that I inherited as a military member. So I came into a system where for centuries now, we've thought of combat in terms of missions, and that does a lot of good for us. One of the things that it does for us is it lets us know that what we're doing right now has a purpose. This mission that I'm on serves some greater function, and if we understand the ramifications to both success and to lack thereof, then it tends to drive our passion. So if we understand the purpose of the mission, we realize there's consequences that could be bad if the mission doesn't go well, that we're probably going to give our all to achieve mission success so we don't let the rest of the grand team of teams down. Another feature of a mission orientation is that we know that when this mission is done, we're either going to be able to celebrate or not. We tend to want to celebrate, so that also drives a desire for performance. And the final feature of it is that we know that there's more missions coming and we've got choices. And the biggest choice that we have at the ultimate end of a mission is whether or not we're going to learn from this iteration to inform the next. And across the globe, I'd say all high-performance teams have gone with the option of learning from this iteration in a way that's positive and forward-focused, so that the next time that we have a mission like this, that we're not repeating the mistakes that we made this time. And by the way, we can capitalize on and reinforce the things that allowed us to win this time around. So this mission orientation is a brilliant thing. Again, it's something that I inherited and I'm grateful for. And I want to address a self-limiting belief, Brittany, and everybody else that's tuned in, that a lot of us as business leaders have. We say, okay, that might work in the military, but we could never think of a mission, in my business. And I passionately disagree with that. I would argue it was actually harder when they first did it to conceive of missions in the military. We've just been doing it for a long time. It's a lot easier to think of missions in business. Quick example from my company, VMax Group. Last year, we launched a new website. That was an example of a mission, something with a measurable outcome defined by way of objectives. And what people are telling us every time that we go in and coach this up and teach how it's practically applied, we don't do objectives very well in business. We set fuzzy goals. We say things like, make this the best event ever. But when we realize at the tail end of that, it's impossible to measure against best event ever. And so that kind of a fuzzy goal doesn't serve us. Where we really benefit is when we start getting clarity on how do we define success. And the way that we teach it is the way that we lived it. We have to set objectives. In order for an objective to serve us, it's got to be three things. It has to be measurable, it has to be achievable, and it has to be time constrained. Only when our objectives are measurable, achievable, and time constrained can we truly measure whether or not we've achieved them. And that's the only way that we can also truly and effectively practice accountability. So the hardest part of the accountability mechanism by far isn't practicing the debrief, it's setting the right objectives. And we did this. I was coaching up a cohort of what we call Top Gun teamwork around Thanksgiving time in the United States, a little bit off timing from our Canadian audience. But the exercise that I put our Top Gun teamwork friends through was equally applicable. I asked them to define what success looks like for Thanksgiving. That was the homework assignment. And it was probably one of the hardest homework assignments that the team had. Like, how does one define success for an event like Thanksgiving? And it proved how difficult the concept is to get correct. But then once they did it, those of whom did it correctly, it was very satisfying to be able to measure against that standard, and especially when they knocked it out of the park, to be able to celebrate having done so by way of good planning. So it's a really important feature. What sets us up is identifying missions and the associated objectives that allow us to practice accountability. And that's the first waypoint on a 5-step process that helps us to build leaders who can truly and effectively lead.
Thank you. We really appreciate that. We do have a few more questions coming in, but we'll wait till the end. I'll let you get back to your presentation, and we can go from there.
Yeah, look, what I'd like to do is just bring back up the Leadership Accelerator framework and sort of, well, if we could just kind of capitalize on those 5 waypoints and consider what it is that we're saying it takes to be able to build real teams that win and to lead in the now. We have to realize that there's a heck of a lot of fear in the organizations that we're a part of. There's a fear of failure. There's a fear of saying the wrong thing. There's a fear of offending. There's a fear of potentially being seen as a meanie. And so ultimately, if we live in fear, it tends to cause us to self-censor. Self-censorship does not feed into strong teamwork. Part of the reason why I've got you on the team, Brittany, is that you think differently than I do, and you think differently than Stephen does. And I need you, if I'm your leader, to speak up and voice your opinion about certain things so that you can help steer this ship effectively. I need to hear what you have to say and what other members of the team have to say. And I'm not going to hear that if you're living in fear. And so we've got to learn to eradicate fear, as Amy Edmondson, Novartis Professor of Leadership and Management at Harvard Business School, talks about. And she's all about building psychological safety. Dr. Timothy Clark, author of The 4 Stages of Psychological Safety, is somebody that I'm a huge proponent of. Maybe even some of the Leader Factor certified practitioners are here listening to this webinar today. You got to build psychological safety in order for accountability to serve you, especially when accountability means taking absolute ownership. And so what is psychological safety? Dr. Timothy Clark defines it as an environment of rewarded vulnerability. And we as leaders have to be comfortable with being vulnerable in order to be able to take ownership when things don't go well. And we have to model what vulnerability looks like in order for our teammates to be able to rise to the occasion and themselves be vulnerable. So building and maintaining psychological safety is a huge leadership demand, something that we ought to be focused on in order to set our teammates up to be able to practice effective team accountability. Now, as I mentioned, with missions and standards, defining our objectives is a really tough thing to do. And if you just think back on, define success, define objectives for Thanksgiving, you realize it's a hard thing to measure. It's probably achievable. The time constraint, also easy. But measuring success, that's the difficulty. But it feeds into learning how to plan to achieve our objectives. And as I've already said, across the business enterprise, tactical planning is a deficiency. Even if we've got great business operating systems, we probably don't actually have a means of planning to achieve whatever our expectations are. And so if we do plan, it's haphazard at best, and it doesn't serve us well. So we have to learn how to plan tactically, something that high-performance teams do exceptionally well. And then we get into team accountability. And I say again, team accountability is something that's practiced as a team, not privately. We never ask the questions, hey team, what went well and what didn't? Useless questions, by the way, that can often mask risk that we're unintentionally carrying forward. I'm on a drive to eradicate those questions from well-intentioned business leaders who don't know any better, and to offer a better way. Team accountability, rethinking it, making sure that we ritualize it, and making sure that we harness it to help the team to learn. That's where we get the true benefit from it. And that's what the debrief sets us up for. And then the final waypoint on this leadership accelerator says we need to understand what a team is. Most of our teams, by the way, aren't teams. And we need to design the organization to empower our teammates to be able to speak up. So when I say that most of our teams aren't, I'll share, I always ask, what's a team? Everywhere I go, I ask, what's a team? And the number one answer that business leaders feeds me is it's a group of people with a common goal. I mean, that's inevitably the answer that I'm going to get. Group of people with a common goal. And probably if you had asked me what a team was 7-8 years ago, I would have said the exact same thing. It's a group of people with a common goal. When I wrote the first book, Debrief to Win, I got a ton of references. I pulled a lot from Harvard Business Review. I was looking who has been doing research into the fields where I haven't to help me to write the book where I reverse engineer an American Air Force fighter squadron. One of the books that I sourced was called The Wisdom of Teams by two researchers, John Katzenbach and Doug Smith, who are all over Harvard Business Review. So I bought their book, The Wisdom of Teams. I read it, and in it, they offered a definition of a team that I thought was eye-opening. They said that a team is a small group of people with complementary skills that shares commitment, first of all, to a common purpose, then to performance goals, then to an approach for which they hold themselves mutually accountable. And they baked accountability into their definition of what a team is. That's a robust definition. It's still a little bit incomplete. That's fine for today's purposes. That 6-part definition, small group of people with complementary skills that shares commitment to a common purpose, to performance goals, they have an approach for which they hold themselves mutually accountable. That's a good thing to measure ourselves against, to figure out where it is that we're deficient so that we can correct those deficiencies. And when it comes to organizational design, we pull from the ancient Prussians, who created an organizational construct that said we need to have centralized command, decentralized execution to win on the battlefields of the now. The Prussian military of the mid-1800s called that concept of having centralized command but decentralized execution, equipping the folks on the front lines to make decisions at their level. They called that mission command. Now, what fuels mission command is having clarity of expectations, a constant theme today, so that folks that have less experience than the generals in the background can make high-quality decisions at their level to advance the cause. So there's a lot baked into this. But the consistent theme is we need to know what we're accountable for, our objectives. We need to plan to achieve what it is that we're accountable for. And our planning has to set us up to win. And then when we get together to practice accountability, it ought to be a team learning event to help us to learn from our successes so that we can repeat them, to help us to learn from our failures so that we don't repeat those, en route to having hope and optimism in a better tomorrow, not occasionally, but always. And that approach tends to serve the NATO alliance exceptionally well. That approach tends to be incredibly effective on business teams. That's an approach that I would argue desperately needs to be adopted across the business enterprise now, because we have no idea what the future holds. If we're wise, we can probably anticipate disruption. We don't want to live in fear of disruption. So if we're wise, we ought to equip our teammates with the ability to learn constantly so that they can navigate disruption. And if we're wise as leaders, we ought to create an environment where we can reduce stress in our lives so that we can have the capacity to think clearly and to make high-quality decisions so that we can lead our teammates effectively. And what better time to do that than at the outset of a brand new year? What an amazing opportunity that we have to kick off this year talking about the mechanism that high-performance teams use to learn always in order to help us to be able to win big, not just this year, but indefinitely. And Brittany, those are my thoughts this fine January morning where it's a little bit colder in Calgary than it is in St. Louis, and I'm open to any additional questions that anybody has for me. I recognize we've covered a ton of ground in a very short period of time, all right? So my apologies.
No, absolutely. We have 5 minutes left for some questions. And one of the things that resonated with me that you said at the beginning is that change is hard. And I do agree that you have to be intentional in how you show up as a leader and for your team. So I do agree. This presentation comes at a perfect time, especially for the new year, and we can all reflect where we are now and how we show up in our workspace and for our teams. Okay, so one question that I have come through is, can you share a personal experience where your own accountability positively influenced your team's performance?
Yeah, great. So part of the reason why I'm in this line of work is that I was diagnosed with colorectal cancer almost 10 years ago this February. So we're coming up on the 10-year anniversary of probably the most disruptive event that has ever hit me. Well, for sure, most disruptive event that I've ever had to deal with, and that includes flying in combat and almost hitting another airplane. And as I dug into, on the heels of this diagnosis and the associated surgeries that basically trapped me in a bathroom all day and all night, pretty much every day of my life, I realized that I found myself complicit in getting cancer. And the reason that I say that is that when I had the symptoms that caused me to get the analysis that led to the surgeries that saved my life, it was the second time that I had these symptoms. And the first time around was 10 years prior when I was young, fit and fine, and I was bulletproof and had no time to be sick, and I was really gung-ho. And I looked at what it is that I had done to my wife by virtue of being trapped in a bathroom all day and all night. I mean, now she's a single parent. At the time, we had 4 children. I couldn't be trusted to take the kids to the school, to zoo, to whatever, because my body was 100% unpredictable, and I felt so bad about it. And so I had a moment of vulnerability, and I came and I basically shared with her that I was sorry for letting her down. And she came back and she said to me, "What do you mean letting me down? You never let me down." And I said, well, I mean, I probably could have at least explored the symptoms when they first hit. And, if we had addressed it back then, it would have never gotten to cancer. So I'm so sorry. I am the root cause of having gotten sick. And she said, no, you're not the root cause. You didn't want this. You never thought that this was going to be something that was in the realm of the possible. You did what probably most people would have done in your shoes. Like, no, I'm not going to accept that you're the root cause of this. She said, but aren't you the one that teaches that accountability is supposed to be this learning thing, and we're supposed to be, learning from it to make things better in the future? I'm like, well, I suppose yes. She's like, so why are you looking backwards? Like, why aren't you looking forwards? And why aren't we harnessing this to help us? I'm like, what a brilliant observation. My teammate, my co-pilot, is teaching me, the person that's been doing this for decades, how to do it the right way. And what we as a family team did is we harnessed this same concept, these same set of principles to build a stronger family team. And it's been a brilliant experience, one that I'm so thankful for. I might even go so far as to say that it's one of the best things that happened to us coming through that painful journey. And the family team, 5 kids now, is humming. And it's our ambition to make sure that the most important team that I'll ever be a part of, that we do everything that I teach publicly, privately, to help us to be the best that we can be. And looking at the way that the relationship has gone with my bride and with my kiddos, I think I can report confidently that we're knocking it out of the park. And so the best illustration that I have isn't a business example, it's a home example. And I would say if this stuff works at home, it ought to work in your business as well. Prove me wrong.
Well, thank you for sharing that. And it's such a good reminder, it can start at home. Okay, we have another question that we can jump to. What is that the rod pole on the wall behind you?
Yeah, okay, that thing right back over there. Great question. It's a gun barrel from an F-22. It's a gun barrel that was decommissioned. It's got a little hairline fracture in it, so it can't be used anymore. And it was the going away gift from my squadron mates in the 7th Fighter Squadron at Holloman Air Force Base, New Mexico. One of the coolest gifts that I've ever been given. Thanks for asking.
Thank you for sharing. Okay, kind of close to the top of the hour. So obviously establishing clear goals plays a big factor in building a great team, and how you establish their expectations and goals for individual team members in terms of their responsibilities and accountability. How do you handle mistakes or setbacks?
How do you handle mistakes? The easiest thing to do is go get a copy of Amy Edmondson's Spectrum of Failure, in order to equip yourself with the understanding that most forms of failure, mistakes, are great. They're great learning opportunities. Overcoming them is going to help us to learn quickly. I want to fail fast. I want to fail early so that I can win when the world's counting on me to do so. And I embrace mistakes.
Thank you. Awesome. Friendly reminder that the Chapter 6, the Debrief to Win, is available in the chat for download. And I just want to thank you, Cujo, for taking the time today and providing Tech Canada's members and viewers tailored insight and definitely actionable takeaways. And a lot of thanks are coming in through LinkedIn Live. I know we had over 100 people tune in as well on LinkedIn. And I want to remind everyone that this webinar has been recorded and will be available on Tech Canada's website in the next few days. So once again, thank you, Cujo, for everything today.
Thank you, Brittany. Thank you, Tech Canada. Thank you for everybody who took a moment to join us today. Know that we're pulling for you here at VMax Group. Keep leading them well. Keep on building real teams that win.
Thank you.